Welcome back. We are back with Bound for Oregon, and we're going to be covering Chapter 6 today. As we remember in Chapter 5, they had to build a bridge to get across a river, and in the process of trying to get ready to go across it, another wagon train was racing to beat them. The importance of that, though, is if they didn't get there in time, by the time that wagon train went through, their bridge would have been broken, and they would have had to start all over again. So we are moving on. They did make it across that bridge in time, and we are at Chapter 6. We had been traveling for 6 weeks now. Surely, I thought, we must be almost to Oregon. As the wagon train rolled along, I kept expecting to see that beautiful land that Father had told us about just beyond the next rise. But beyond the next rise would only be more waves of grass. We had come 400 miles, Father told me when I asked him, but we still had nearly 2,000 miles ahead of us. I stopped looking for Oregon on the horizon. Soon after we crossed the Wakarusa, it began to rain again. For 3 days and nights, the rain came pouring down, as if sloshing from a great tipped pan in the sky, making it impossible for our wagon train to move. While the men took care of the stock, did the milking, gathered wood, and tried to keep the fires going, most of the women and children stayed inside the wagons and tents. Everything was damp and covered with mud, and smoke from the fires was always in our eyes. Lavinia and I kept busy with our books. She was just beginning to read small words, and I was trying to memorize one of my favorite Longfellow poems. We taught Cynthia to count up to 6 and recite Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. One day Mother was not feeling very well. She seemed tired, and after lunch went to lie down in the wagon. Lavinia and I were watching Cynthia inside the tent, but after a while we all grew tired of playing games and singing songs, and Cynthia began to get cranky. "What is all this noise?" John poked his head inside the tent door. "Hi dar, Don." Cynthia's pout suddenly turned into a smile. "Hi thar, Cynthia," he grinned back. Raindrops rolled off his rubber coat and hat, making a growing puddle on the tent floor. "How would you girls like it if I made some popcorn?" "In the rain?" asked Lavinia, her eyes wide. "Why not? I couldn't get much wetter." "I'll help you," I offered. While Lavinia and Cynthia watched from the tent door, John and I built up the campfire as hot as we could. Then we heated up the Dutch oven and dropped in some popping corn. As we crouched close to the fire waiting for the sound of popping, the rain began coming down even harder. Smoke swirled into my eyes, making them stream with tears. I moved to the other side of the fire, but the smoke seemed to be following me. I couldn't see, nor could I hear any popping. "Do you think the corn is ready?" I called to John over the wind and pounding rain. "Must be," he answered. By this time I hardly cared. I just wanted to get back inside the dry tent. John lifted the Dutch oven out of the fire and followed me inside. "They're all burned," Lavinia cried in disappointment as he took off the lid. About half the kernels were black around the edges, and the other half hadn't even popped. John picked out a piece that wasn't so burnt. "It's good," he pronounced, chewing it. "Try it." So we all did. It was certainly not like the perfectly puffed white popcorn that Mama used to make at home, but flavored with wood smoke from the fire and eaten inside our warm tent with the rain beating down overhead, it tasted delicious to me. "More!" demanded Cynthia. And burned or not, we finished off all the popcorn. The fiddler in the nearby wagon kept playing his cheerful tunes in the evening, and the old grandmother with the pipe kept calling to me, "You do be a fine little gal." The mother said her mind must be weak. I liked hearing it just the same. However, the wet and gloomy weather was beginning to take its toll on some of the families in camp. As I went to the stream for water or to collect sticks for the fire, I could hear men grumbling and women scolding. A few days earlier, we had encountered a group of returning travelers. They were full of discouraging stories about the dangers and hardships that lay ahead. Listening to them, some people had become disheartened and talked of going back home. When the sun finally came out again, most were ready to continue, but 4 families, including that of the very sick girl Lucinda, turned back. I sat up on the spring seat, watching their wagons grow smaller and smaller until they were only bright specks in the distance, and I wondered how they would do at the Corduroy Bridge. It was a raw, chilly evening when we halted on the banks of the Kaw River. All of the recent rains and the melting snows of winter had swollen this small stream into a wide and mighty river. Looking at its muddy, swift-running currents, I couldn't help feeling a little shiver of fear. How were we ever going to cross all that water? "We will have to wait a few days for a river to subside," the father told us, after returning from a meeting with the captain and the other men. So once again, we settled in to wait. We were not the only ones. All up and down the banks of the Kaw, other wagon trains were doing the same. Everywhere I looked, I saw rows of white wagon covers and tents, teams of horses and mules, huge herds of grazing cattle, barking dogs, and running children. We soon found out that there was a great deal of discouragement among the people camped there. By now, many were weary of the journey and frightened of the stories they had heard. Every day, more wagons were turning around and heading back home. Their fears spread to our wagon train. At night, worried voices talked around the campfires. "What about this river crossing?" I heard a man from Ohio ask anxiously one evening. "I hear tell 2 men were drowned along with a dozen cattle a few days back. And folks are talking about seeing Indian war parties all painted up, not far from here." That was Charlie and Matilda's father talking. Short man with bright red hair, just like Charlie's. At that, his wife began to cry. "Take me home, Jake. Oh, I never did want to leave our family back in Pennsylvania." It was no wonder people were beginning to waver. There were more discussions, a few heated arguments, and many tears. Once or twice I even thought I saw father and mother exchanging worried looks. Just for a moment I let myself imagine what it would be like to return home, driving by the familiar farms, with the new crops coming up, fresh and green, seeing all the folks we used to know look up, surprised to see us, then smile and wave, passing by the schoolhouse, the meeting house, and then driving up the gate at Grandma's house. At the sound of the wagon, she would put down her sewing and look out the window, unable at first to believe her eyes. Then she would come running to meet us, the tears streaming down her face, now tears of joy, and I would feel her warm arms around me again. I looked at father. Something in his face changed, I thought, in the weeks since we had left Arkansas, and especially since crossing the bridge over the Wakarusa. The line in his jaw was sharper, firmer, and a determined light burned in those steady blue-gray eyes. Seeing it, I knew that he would not turn back. Out of the 100 wagons that had set out from Independence, all but 4 turned around at the Kaw River. The 4 included the Grants and ourselves. Then there was a family named Tendrose, consisting of a couple with a baby and the young wife's unmarried brother. And finally, another family with 4 children, the oldest of whom, Sarah Jane, was just a few months younger than I. Sadly, Lavinia and I watched as each of the returning wagons got ready to pull out. The men hitched up their oxen in a dejected kind of way, it seemed to me. Yet some of the women were smiling. Our friends Charlie and Matilda were among the first to leave. They waved to us from the back of their wagon, their 2 bright heads framed above the crate of clucking chickens. The captain looked just like another tired farmer without his silver trumpet in his hand. The man who owned Towser turned back, as did the old gentleman who played the fiddle and the grandmother with the pipe. She leaned out of her wagon as it rolled by, and for the last time I heard her say, "You do be a fine little gal." Odd as she was, I was going to miss her. I lifted my hand and waved. After being part of such a large train, it seemed strange and lonesome to be on our own again, without a captain to lead us. But we didn't have long to think about it. Preparations were underway for crossing the river. Some families from other wagon trains had gone to an old ferry boat downstream, but those who ran it charged high prices, and it was not considered very safe. So after discussion among the men, our 4 families decided to wait for the river to go down and cross on our own. To do this, the wagon beds had to be turned into boats. I watched as all the contents of each wagon were unpacked and piled on the ground. The wagon beds were taken off the running gear and turned upside down. Then the men went to work caulking each seam with resin and tar, inside and out, so no water would be able to seep in. The job was messy and took hours to complete. After that, the wagon beds were dragged down to the water's edge. Day by day, the river had been slowly going down. Now at last it was low enough for us to try to cross. The wagon beds were in the water, loaded up and tied to the bank. But first the animals had to be driven across. Father and Mr. Grant, mounted on our 2 horses, rounded up all the stock and headed them for the riverbank. "Hoyay! Hoyay!" they shouted, cracking their whips. Cattle and loose horses milled around at the water's edge. The fearful animals did not seem to want to take the plunge. Some turned around trying to run away, but the stinging whips forced them forward. "Hoyay!" Now they were all in shallow water. I saw Bright, one of our oxen, stumble, and the others appeared to walk right over him. Then all at once, they were swimming. As the animals reached deeper water, most of the cattle settled down to steady swimming, but the loose horses plunged and snorted and kept trying to turn back. Father and Mr. Grant had to keep their own horses constantly moving and their whips flying. Just as they were nearing the opposite bank, I noticed that Daisy, our little 2-year-old heifer, was in trouble. She was struggling frantically in the swift current. I could see her light brown head rising and falling. "Father!" I screamed, but he could not hear me above the rushing water, and he was too far away to reach her. Then suddenly I saw Daisy turn over on her side and float away down the river. "Oh!" cried John, standing next to me. "Our 2-year-old yearling is drowning. What can we do?" Lavinia began to sob quietly. John kept waving his arms and shouting in his high-pitched voice, "Our 2-year-old yearling is drowning." Something was wrong with what he was saying, I thought vaguely. A yearling couldn't be 2 years old. Nearby, Sarah Jane and her young 2 brothers were beginning to smile, but I couldn't smile. Our favorite little heifer was gone. All the rest of the animals made it safely across. In a few minutes, Father and Mr. Grant came back to help with the wagons. Ours was the first to go. A long, strong rope was attached to the front of the wagon bed. Mr. Tedros, a tall, muscular young man with a blond mustache, took the end of it. He swam the river on his horse, then secured the rope around a good-sized tree on the opposite bank. Another rope was fastened in the same way behind. Father and John each picked up an oar. "We're ready," said Father. My knees were trembling uncontrollably as I stepped on board that floating wagon. All I could think about was Daisy and how she had looked at that moment when the rushing water took her away. Mother held Cynthia in her arms. Lavinia, her cheeks still streaked with tears, clutched my hand as she never would let it go. In a moment, Father had pushed off, and he and John were paddling. All the work of caulking the wagon had been worthwhile. Hardly a drop leaked in. Slowly, with Father and John working hard at the oars, our lumbering craft moved out onto the middle of the river. Now we were in that fast-moving current, very close to the spot where Daisy had been lost. White spray flew through the air. Beneath my feet, I could feel the wagon bed being tossed and pulled. Fear moved up to my stomach, which began to churn like the swift water. I had to close my eyes. Here you can see the animals being taken across the river. When I opened them again, I was sure that we too were being swept away. "Pull!" Father shouted to John. "Harder!" I realized that now I was gripping Lavinia's hand so tight that tears were squeezing out of her eyes again. John was paddling furiously. Father, on the downside stream, worked just as hard. On the opposite shore, Mr. Tedros was struggling to tighten the rope around the tree. The wagon creaked and groaned. It seemed as if the raging water might tear it apart. Then very slowly we began to swing toward shore. Moments later, I felt our wagon softly nudge against the riverbank. John jumped out and tied it fast, and Lavinia and I hugged each other in relief. As we stepped onto solid land once more, I looked back at the river. Where was Rover? When we started out, I had seen him jump into the water behind us, then had lost track of him after I closed my eyes. I scanned the rough water for a glimpse of his white face, his curling black-tipped tail, but I couldn't see any sign of him. Had he, like Daisy, been washed away by the fierce current? Then suddenly behind me I heard a familiar flapping shake, and there he was, dripping wet and limping a little but safe. "Rover!" cried Lavinia. Wet as he was, we gathered him into our arms, and his tail beat joyfully against the muddy earth. We stood on the riverbank, watching while the other wagons crossed one by one. It took several hours, but all of them made it safely. After that, each family was busy setting up their wagons again, sorting out belongings, repacking them, drying out all the clothing and bedding and sacks of food that had gotten damp in the crossing. It was not until late that evening, when our family was gathered around the campfire, that I thought again of Daisy. I remember the rough, soft feel of her tongue licking my fingers, making me want to laugh and squirm at the same time. I remember the way she used to look at me with her moist, dark brown saucer eyes when she came to be petted. My own eyes filled with tears. Father had been reading to us from the Bible. He stopped in the middle of the verse and looked across to me. "It could have been much worse, you know, Mary Ellen," he said quietly. "We must be thankful that all our people and our wagons and teams made it safely across." Thinking about it, I knew he was right. What if it had been Buck or Ben who had been lost? Or Mr. Grant, or John, or Father? A long shiver ran down my backbone at the unimaginable thought, but tears ran down my cheeks anyway. I cried for my pet calf, whom I would not see or touch ever again, and I was crying for those other things too. Our warm, wonderful barn and our house, and every little tree and piece of earth that I had known, and Grandma. Everything back home that was lost to me now, because it was certain now that we were not going back. We had crossed the river, and we had to go on. I hope you enjoyed that chapter. I will see you again with chapter 7.